Well, good afternoon, everybody. Julia Ioffe, welcome, welcome. I'm desperately sorry that we're not in person together. And for those who don't follow Twitter, Julia sadly is not with us in person today because she has tested positive and is now being quite careful and quarantining. So we're lucky to still have her here. Founding partner of Puck, a new digital media outlet of which we are proud investors and supporters of, covering the four corners of power and relevance in America today. Julie is the Washington correspondent, and at this point, you know, the guru on all things Russia, Ukraine. So we are very, very excited and happy to have you, to talk to today. And just sorry that you're not with us. I would start by a very probably off-color White House Correspondents' Dinner COVID joke, but I'll let you off the hook on that one. But do want to maybe start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself. Your writing has been not just insightful as to the quickly moving dynamics within this conflict, but frankly, because of your personal background, having been born in Moscow and come to the States at a young age, it just feels deeply, deeply personal, and I'm sure it is for you. Maybe just give us a little sense of you and your background and how that background has sort of informed your reporting.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for having me and for adjusting so quickly. As you can see, I came up for this event to New York and felt a tickle in my throat after Nerd Prom last weekend. And sure enough, like everybody else I know in DC, I now have COVID now for the third time. But all jokes aside, the last few months have been really difficult for the reasons you mentioned. And so I was born in Moscow in the Soviet Union. So I'm from a country that doesn't exist anymore. And in 1990, I came here. I was 7 years old with my family. We came as refugees from part of that big wave of Soviet Jewish refugees who were fleeing institutionalized state anti-Semitism, known as the Jackson Vanik Jews, essentially. And I was 7, and I could have gone like a lot of my, fellow immigrant kids, fellow refugee kids. I could have just become fully American, and like my sister, for example, and just left Russian behind and left my first grade Russian where it is, and just, speak kitchen Russian with my parents. But I just kept getting drawn to the subject, and much to my parents' chagrin, when I went to college, I started off as a pre-med, thinking I would be a doctor like my mom and her mom and her mom, and now my little sister. I instead took a Soviet history class along with organic chemistry and biology, and that was it. It was over for me. And I ended up majoring in Soviet history and minoring in Russian literature, and started traveling there all the time. And then I moved there when I was 27, and I lived there for 3 years, worked there as a correspondent for the New Yorker in foreign policy. And even when I moved back to the States as an adult in 2012, I was going back all the time for work, for fun. I had, now had connections of my own there. I had made my own friends. My grandmother was living there until recently. And I don't know, it just became, like so many people, addicted to the place. And when it comes to this conflict, it's particularly painful because even though most of my connections, my personal connections, are with Russia, like so many Soviet Jews and like so many American Jews who say they're from Russia or Poland, the parts of the Russian Empire that my family is from is mostly Ukraine. So 6 of my 8 great-grandparents are from Ukraine. Several of my grandparents were born there. And, but we eventually became, residents of what became Russia. So it's like so many post-Soviet families, there's a lot of Russian, there's a lot of Ukrainian and connections. And it feels like, a civil war, except one side is obviously completely in the wrong. And to see, the country of my birth doing this to Ukraine, to see it justified in my mother tongue, to know that there are people who support it. It's just, it breaks my heart and makes me extremely angry.
Well, I can only try and imagine, but obviously it's very personal to you and your family. There's so much to talk about, and I know how much everybody wants to hear from you, and I'm going to try and save enough time at the end for people's questions because we scrambled last minute to do this on Zoom. I'll be relaying people's questions, but maybe just given that opening, pivoting to sort of some of this in a little bit more in depth. You clearly have a non-Western lens towards this, and I'll keep using the word conflict. But you have a non-Western lens towards this, given your background. What do you think is the, kind of probably biggest miss or misconception, from Western media, in particular, not in this current conflict, but in covering Russia broadly over the last number of decades? I mean, without, being too leading, I mean, it just does feel like the narrative has been that Putin and Russia are these masterful tacticians and strategists who never get anything wrong and, kind of really have, mastered the game of chess. Is that right? What are we all sort of missing?
Well, that's one of the big things that I think people in the U.S. are missing. It's this idea that Putin is a master strategist, that the Russians are these perfect villains who are 10 feet tall and just both meticulous. I mean, it's funny just to like even say it, that they meticulously plan everything and get it flawlessly executed every time. Is just comical. I remember when I was at the Atlantic, I went back to Moscow for a story, and I was interviewing this military analyst who has very close ties to the Russian defense ministry. And he was like, I'm so confused. You guys keep describing us as if we're Germans, but we're not Germans, we're Russians. We're messy. Things don't work. Things break all the time. I mean, if you think about how many times they keep trying to, as much as like they've killed and poisoned a lot of journalists and dissidents and people like spy turncoats, they keep missing a lot, right? Like they went to Salisbury to try to poison Sergei Skripal, the former spy, and his daughter. And they did not poison, I mean, they poisoned them. They didn't kill them. They killed some random British lady because they put the Novichok in a Nina Ricci perfume bottle, and they just chucked it into a dumpster, and some British guy took it, brought it home to his wife as a gift, and she sprayed it all over her face and neck. If you think about what they did in 2016 and how they broke into the DNC servers, it illustrated, for example, all the infighting inside the various factions of the Russian government, where it's like like an octopus where the tentacles don't know what the other tentacles are doing and are often fighting with each other. So inside the DNC servers, what they found was that one of the, I keep confusing the two bears, Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, but one of the bears was in there quietly for a long time. That was the FSB bear, and quietly kind of rooting around and like gathering all this data from the DNC servers. And then the other one, the GRU bear, just like busts in because cybersecurity was very sexy and Putin was really into it. And it was a good way to like, A, earn your stripes internally, and B, get more money from the federal budget for your folks, right? Which means you can steal a lot more. So GRU bear busts in there, starts, and they're not very good at cyber stuff the way the FSB is. So they start just like crashing around in there. And that's how the Americans, CrowdStrike found the bears inside the DNC servers, right? It's like, it's a little bit like Pink Panther style, the gang who should, and I have so many examples like that. But
Like
in this
Fake Street was one of my favorites.
Fake Street is the best. I'm so glad you remember
that can't actually be real. Is that real?
It's 100% real. It was in the FBI complaint. Do you want me to tell people
I
what that
want you to tell it to the crowd. Yes, please.
So I don't know if people remember back in 2010, there was the case of the illegals and Anna Chapman, who I think every American male immediately had a crush on. And basically the FBI found 10 Russian sleeper agents called illegals who had been living under assumed identities Some of them had even had kids here who didn't know that their parents were Russian spies. Anyway, and there was this big spy exchange back in 2010. They like met on the tarmac, exchanged spies, and flew away. But Anna Chapman, the redhead, if you read the FBI complaint, what you saw was that she realized that the FBI was onto her, and so she walked across the Brooklyn Bridge to Brooklyn, went and bought a burner phone, and to register the burner phone, she wrote her real name, and then for the address, she wrote 99 Fake Street.
Didn't work out.
Which
Didn't work out.
it didn't work out. But, more seriously, if you think about this war, ostensibly,
Yeah.
at least on paper, Putin says that it was about NATO, right? That it was about NATO expansion up to his borders, that it was a big threat to him. He has done everything to make sure NATO expands. I mean, it looks like Sweden and Finland are going to join. They're set to declare that they want to join NATO, I think in a week or so. And I think NATO is going to fast track them. The thing that kicked off the 2014 revolution that set all of this off in Kiev, if people remember the Maidan, was the fact that the puppet president of Ukraine at the time, the Russian puppet president, Viktor Yanukovych, signed an agreement with the EU that was a declaration that at some point they would start economically working together down the line. And this was in the fall of 2013. And Putin said absolutely not. And he put pressure on him to withdraw. He withdrew, and people went out onto Maidan and started protesting. That's what has kicked off all of this that we're reaping the fruits of now. But it looks like Ukraine is on a fast track to EU membership. After all that, it's like before he, and then I'll wrap up this answer, but before he invaded Ukraine in 2014, NATO was all about Afghanistan. The only time Article 5, the collective defense part of the NATO charter, was invoked was after 9/11. And so NATO was fighting in Afghanistan. It was basically finding a new mission for itself that was not really about Russia anymore, because people felt like that was, old Cold War news. Then Putin invades Ukraine, and now NATO is all about Russia and countering Russia. And, I think it's not just that he's a bad strategist. I think it's that he has these paranoid delusions that he then almost wants to come true, if that makes sense. Because it makes
manifesting it.
Yeah.
So I actually want to come back to that time frame. I think the Budapest memorandum's around that same time frame, but just maybe if you could just lay a little bit more background for us on the man himself. I mean, part of what I think about is just not being an expert on this is, what's changed, right? Has anything changed? Is this the same guy he's been since the KGB however many years ago, or, we all change over time? COVID, I gather, wasn't great for him, and was there an inflection point here? Was all of this inevitable? Was there an inflection point? Is this somebody that, has, kind of abandoned the West in a more, violent way today than maybe 5 years ago? Is there something new here?
I think we both do and don't change over time, right? Like the core personality stays the same and sometimes gets warped and stretched out in different places as we get older. I think if you look back at Putin's biography, it's hard to do that, by the way, looking back at people's biography, because certain things will jump out as kind of like, aha, that was a sign, right. But it is very much, reconstructing. Yeah. But for example, if we're going to do that anyway, if you look at, so Putin was named Boris Yeltsin's successor on December 31st, 1999. They go on TV and they announce it together. And in March, he had to stand for election, and he was relatively unknown, and the Kremlin's big spin doctors had to kind of introduce him to the people. And they did this thing where they had 3 journalists interview him and basically quickly put out this book called In the First Person. That's a series of interviews with him and his then wife and a bunch of his childhood friends. And what really, I had to reread it recently for my book, and what really stuck out to me this time was how much, and this kind of ties into your earlier question about what the West doesn't get about him. I think the West is so focused on the KGB stuff, which is very, very important, and I think was very much, on one hand, personality forming, but also he clearly had a kind of personality and point of view that he wanted to join that kind of organization. But I think what a lot of Americans miss, because they don't know this culturally, is like the street kid aspect of him.
Right.
So he was born in 1952, right after the war. His family's from Leningrad. This also stuck out to me. His father served in the NKVD, which is the precursor to the KGB, which is the precursor to the FSB. His grandfather served in the KGB and was actually a chef for Lenin's widow and a little bit for Stalin. So he kind of is, an heir to this tradition. But also he was born in a destroyed city after the war. His older brother starved to death in Leningrad during the siege. His mom barely made it out alive. His dad was severely wounded in battle, made it out. So he grows up in this really environment where everybody's massively traumatized by World War II, right? So the Soviet Union lost 15% of its population in 4 years. So his family, my family, everybody lost many, many, many people. And what's interesting is, for a long time, my father was my main Putin interpreter. My father and his buddies, his college buddies, who were all born. So Putin was born in 52. They were all born 55, 58, 59. And as I discovered in working on my book, which is about Russian women, the period after the war was known as Bezatsovshchina, the era of no fathers, because a lot of men didn't come home from war, because the government wanted a baby boom, and they tried to encourage unmarried women to have children by themselves, and the state would be kind of in loco parentis. And the men that were around who did come back from the war were often so damaged that they were barely there, as Putin's father was. And so a lot of these kids, especially the boys, grew up on the streets. They were basically like the kids from the projects. And there was a certain code that they all learned to live by. It was a code of honor. And then it became, for a lot of those kids who ended up in the penal system, it's the code of the criminals and the crooks. And but they believe that it's a code of honor, that there are certain things you do and don't do. And often when Putin speaks, these things, these terms, these words jump out that are very much from the schoolyard / prison yard. And, the way he surrounds himself, the women he surrounds himself with, the way he talks, again, he's just like a grown-up street urchin who ended up president instead of going to prison, sorry. And this is a really winding answer to your question, but yeah, and then he joins the KGB because, the other thing that I think the West focuses on, but kind of misinterprets, is the judo. He's a judo master. He loves martial arts. But the reason he started judo is because he was little. He's a little guy, very short, very scrawny, and was picked on in the yard, but he wanted to rule the roost. He wanted to be the head guy in charge. And judo promised to give him some skills to dominate the yard, dominate the other boys in the yard. And the KGB was also part of that. And because he was watching this show, post-war show that glorified the KGB.
Right.
Yeah. So that's
there's a lot there, and a lot of psychology to it. I guess. I mean, part of the question at this moment we're in right now is, how much of this was inevitable on two sides, right? On Putin's side, how much of where we are is just sort of the dreams and ambition of a man in the later part of his career who's thinking about legacy, thinks the biggest travesty in Russian history was the breakup of the empire, and was just sort of hell-bent on putting it back together. So this was inevitable from that perspective. The kind of, Western corollary is, what, if anything, could have our government, the Biden administration, or anyone for that matter, have done earlier to give him an off-ramp, to give him some way out of this thing? Because it does feel like that was there may have, I don't know, maybe there was a moment in time where there was like a sneak door where somebody could have gotten off of this thing. But was this all inevitable, or were there obvious, or at least things that were obvious to you that were tactical mistakes?
I mean, it's the million-dollar question. I think given how things unfolded, it was inevitable. Like, by the time you get to the Biden administration, it's almost too late. A lot of Russians, a few years ago started talking about, why wasn't there a Marshall Plan? Why wasn't there a Marshall Plan for the former Soviet Union in 1991? For a long time, people, and I think that is,
It's a question.
that's a valid idea. I also don't know if the Russians would have taken it. There's a lot of pride there. They do see themselves as an empire, and that like the only organic way for Russia to exist is as an empire, although a lot of that is current propaganda, so it becomes very hard to tease out.
Right.
I think the way shock therapy was implemented, both by people like Jeffrey Sachs, but Russian reformers too, like Yegor Gaidar, the way that the Russian population was kind of impoverished in the 90s. But then again, the reason they were impoverished in the 90s was because the Soviet Union basically went bankrupt. So it wasn't, it was only partly because of
Right.
these radical economic reforms of the 90s. I think there was maybe a missed opportunity in not disbanding NATO in 1991. So Putin, in the run-up to this war, kept talking about how the West made a promise to Russia to not expand NATO by 1 inch in the late 80s. He kept saying that they promised Gorbachev this, and then they violated their promise and therefore were justified. And Gorbachev has over the years come out many times and publicly said that there was no promise made, and he didn't even ask for the promise. He kind of couldn't even imagine that NATO would expand because the Cold War was coming to an end. So personally, I think I don't understand why NATO was not disbanded back in 91.
Got it. And I guess there's a lot, and obviously many years, and obviously many different U.S. presidents, and it wasn't just a U.S. story. But I guess the final piece of the puzzle vis-a-vis other lenses is that of the Russian population, the Russian people, and not even that it's an antiquated narrative, but the narrative in the States over fake news and media and all that kind of stuff, you can sort of hear that conversation about the influence of the media and quote unquote fake news here in the States. Can imagine what that looks like for 20 years of state-controlled media in Russia. But it is striking, and we do get the question. I mean, many of the standard folks on this video tonight are all around the globe and experience many different lenses and many different histories and experiences. But the question comes up, can you differentiate between Putin and the Russian people? And maybe you could at one point and you can't right now, but how do you sort of explain this clearly false narrative about getting rid of Nazis and fascism inside of Ukraine? And how do you sort of explain the Russian population buy-in, for lack of better terms, if you want to say that there is a buy-in?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot in your excellent question, but I think that it's difficult because look, we have in America, it took 1 year for Fox News and Newsmax and OAN and social media to convince a majority of Republicans that Biden is not the legitimately elected president and that Trump actually won in 2020. And that's 1 year in a basically free media environment where real information is readily and easily available to you. In Russia, people are living with that kind of onslaught of, it's like, imagine if there was just Fox News and OAN and Newsmax, only that for 22 years, and that you had to, over the years, employ an increasing amount of tricks to get around it, right?
Yeah.
It becomes harder and harder to find and scavenge for real information. Like now, you
Yeah.
can really only get it through VPNs. We also don't know, I think anecdotally, we know that a lot of Russians support the war. The polls indicate that Putin's support has gone through the roof with this war. I mean, his ratings are now in the mid-80s. Over 2/3 of Russians say they support this war, but again, to use a US example, like think about our polling and where it led us in 2016 and 2020. And similar issues exist in Russia, right? Like calling people during the day on landlines, which means you're reaching older people. And there, you also have you run into the problem of the Soviet past. These older
Right.
people lived in the Soviet Union. They're closer to the political repressions of the Soviet Union. So when somebody calls them on the phone and says they're from an official sounding organization and asks them, do you support Vladimir Putin? And do you support the war? What are they going to say?
Get it. No, it's
So,
I
so
can
that,
imagine. Yeah, I can imagine the psychology of parents sending children into a war that they at least want to believe is a just war. Hard to imagine sending your kids off to die as an aggressor. But even if that is what it is.
yeah, I do want to say one thing. So like in reporting, reading, writing about Russia over all these years, in 2015, I finally read Svetlana Alexievich, who that year won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And she's Belarusian, started off as a journalist, and then started doing these oral histories of first the Soviet space, then the former Soviet space. The HBO series Chernobyl is very heavily based on her book about Chernobyl. But reading her book Secondhand Time and then reading her book Zinke Boys about the war in Soviet war in Afghanistan, it just completely revolutionized the way I saw the country I was from, and I was like, I've been writing about this all wrong. I've been writing about this country completely wrong, not factoring all the trauma into it, not factoring these powerful psychological drivers of like, nobody wants to think they're a bad person. Nobody wants to think that they are on the side of evil. In the book Zinke Boys, I think that was her first book because she was a Soviet journalist deployed to Afghanistan to cover the invasion, the Soviet invasion. And, she writes about all these young, 18-year-old boys who go to Afghanistan, they're getting their limbs ripped off. They're seeing their friends get blown apart. They don't know why they're there. They're bitter, they're confused, and she writes this book and she talks to some of their mothers too. And then when the book comes out, the mothers sue her because they said, no, you wrote that our boys died for nothing, but they didn't die for nothing. They were heroes.
Right.
And they took her to court and they won. And I think about that all the time when Americans say like, well, when the coffins start coming home, aren't the mothers going to go out into the streets? They didn't when the US went into Iraq and the, coffins started coming home either, I think in part for this reason.
No, it's the human part of it is what's so painful to imagine, from the Russian population. Turning a little bit to sort of where we are in the conflict, is the U.S. doing enough? Is NATO doing enough? Is the West doing enough? And specifically, are sanctions effective? I mean, are these things that will, actually change Putin's course, change an outcome in any way?
I don't know. I don't know that these sanctions are fully intended to do that. I think there's a hope that they will, but I think at some point there's just a sense that we have to do something. We can't let this go unpunished. And also we can't let him continue funding this war. So let's apply as much economic pressure as we can on Russia. But so far, the sanctions haven't hit quite as hard unless you're an oligarch or unless you are people like you and me who travel a lot, who speak other languages, who, well, maybe not you, people who are like upper middle class in Russia who have some investments, who have some savings, who are very Western oriented. They were hit really hard and they were kind of the West's biggest allies internally. So there's a lot of resentment brewing there because a lot of them, for example, hundreds of thousands of them have fled. The entire creative class of Russia is now, well, not entire, but almost the entire creative class of Russia is outside of Russia now. And because of Visa and MasterCard jumping on the bandwagon and saying like, we didn't have to, but we're going to pull out of Russia. What ended up happening is that the people who left Russia couldn't use their visas and MasterCards, but the people who stayed in Russia, so the people who work for, Russian state propaganda or the Russian state oil company or whatever, they can still use their visas and MasterCards internally because they're serviced by other kind of local processors. And the poorest people who are Putin's kind of main base of support will never really be hit by sanctions, except for, the kind of inflationary effects of them. But what we're seeing so far is that it's like a lot of sanctions do in Iran, in Cuba, they're breeding a lot of anti-American resentment and anti-Western resentment because it's seen as collective punishment. And in Russia, it's like, well, you're all ganging up on us. So plus we're in the middle of a war. So there's like a twofold reason to rally around the flag and the president and the war itself. But again, we're only 2.5 months in, it's still early days.
Yeah.
And as for NATO, I think NATO and the US are doing a lot. I think the Ukrainians always want us to do more. The Ukrainians want us to just go in and fight the Russians because they know how quickly that fight would end. And for obvious reasons, neither NATO nor the US want to do that. So I think there will always be that divergence of interests and that inherent tension between Kiev and the West.
I get that. I guess the natural follow-on question is just sort of the sustainability of the situation, right? It does not feel like the current situation, is sustainable for a very long period of time, socially, economically, or from a militaristic perspective. Talk about sort of the Russian economy and not just sanctions, but increasing sanctions and a related energy crisis in particular in Europe. I mean, how long can Russia actually sustain a conflict like this?
For a long time. I worry that they could do this for years. And that's my sense, but it's also what I'm hearing. I'm hearing in Washington and what I'm hearing from Russia, from Kiev. Back to your original point about how they're, the gang who couldn't shoot straight, as we see, so much of their shit doesn't work. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right, like 18% of their missiles and their rockets don't explode. And apparently that's an improvement because early in the war it was 35%. Like you have soldiers with, and it's a lot of this is because they're just corrupt as hell, right? And the soldiers had MREs that were from like 2013, and they were going around looting Ukrainian villages and sending stuff home, right? Like, I mean, this is crazy that they stole like $1 billion worth of stuff in Ukraine once they got to the kind of the rich suburbs around Kiev, and then they crossed, to washing machines and electric scooters and like the hoods of cars, and you could see the database of this mail, I don't know what to call it. It's like a Russian or Belarusian FedEx, essentially. So Ukrainian hackers hack them and then put on a map all the Russian addresses where all that stuff from Ukraine was sent. And it's like across all of Russia, it's just like all dots, like all pins. And there was a joke going around that a Russian soldier calls home and says, man, Mom, I'm in Ukraine. What a meat grinder. And she's like, we don't need a meat grinder. Send a blender instead. So, but I think they can keep it going for a long time. This is not all they have. They could, there's a lot of talk that on May 9th, on Victory Day, they're going to announce a national draft and a national mobilization of reservists. They have a lot more equipment. They also, Russians are really good at suffering if they're given a cause to suffer for.
Yeah.
Like Americans freak out when their gas gets a little bit more expensive. And Americans will often ask me like, oh, I heard, the Russian economy is not doing so well. Aren't people, this is well before the war, aren't the Russian people going to go out and protest and topple Putin? And you have to understand that in the Russian, I was talking about this with some Russian friends, and they were like, look, most Russian people, if they're not being killed en masse, they're good. Like,
Good.
yeah, as long as it's not getting worse, even if it is getting worse, like I think they will bear a lot for years before there's any kind of popular uprising. Can I tell you one more Soviet joke about this, the Russian mentality? So basically you have a lot of like a crowd of Russian peasants, and they're all standing in raw sewage that goes like right to here. And one guy kind of sticks his head up and he looks around and he's like, why are we all standing here in shit? Let's get up and improve our lot. Come on, guys. And another guy goes, shh, stop making waves. So that's
I got it.
when that's your national.
Is there any
you're not gonna, you can go on for years.
To the kind of point of suffering in the Russian psychology, is there any generational dynamic to it? I mean, I can understand for those born in the 50s, but for the younger demographic that has lived a more Western type life for the last 20 years, it's not like North Korea or Iran who never had that, and so you're not taking something away from somebody. But for those who kind of were born into this version of Putin's Russia, is that's a much ruder awakening, and I wonder if that kind of endurance is generational.
I think a lot of those people have left.
Right.
And those are the people who were used to a certain Western level of comfort and for a certain kind of global and Western lifestyle. A lot of them picked up and left. They were the ones who had passports and visas. I think for the others, that's what propaganda is for, and that's what the school books are for.
Yeah.
The other thing, sorry, to your previous question about the sanctions and the economy, the sanctions are, they on one hand, they're very, very strong, and Russia didn't expect them. On the other hand, the main spigot hasn't been turned off. So Russia is getting nearly $1 billion a day for oil and gas. That's a lot of money. And, especially when the ruble, if the ruble gets cheap, it's recovered some value, but if the ruble tanks again, because the central bank can't prop it up anymore, you're getting basically dollars for your oil and gas, and your expenditures are in rubles. And so cost of doing business internally is cheaper, and they're set to get, because this is also driving up energy prices around the world, they're getting more money. So in some ways, this is paying for itself.
So if they have more staying power than maybe we would hope, and talk of some rogue assassination is misguided, the proverbial question, or that everybody wants to know is where's this going? How does this end? And I guess not knowing that there's no great answer to that question, maybe the better question is, what are the things that we should be paying attention to, right? What should we be paying attention to on May 9th? What should we be focused on vis-a-vis, Moldova and Belarus and Poland? How do we have any comfort it doesn't spill out of Ukrainian borders and NATO doesn't get pulled into it? I mean, what are the things you're looking at to just sort of, at least keep your eye on?
I'm looking at all those things. What's happening in Moldova is really worrying. You had it seemed like a false flag operation in Tiraspol in Transnistria, in the capital of Transnistria. There were these mysterious explosions that the Transnistrian quote unquote government immediately said was done by the Ukrainians, and the Russians immediately were like, do you want our help? And it was, the idea is to start a second front, which would make fighting harder for Ukraine and would make it easier to cut it off from the Black Sea as well as the Azov Sea. So I think a lot of it will hinge on what happens militarily. A lot of it will hinge on whether Russia escalates and decides to bomb, for example, a weapons depot, let's say in Poland, through which a lot of these NATO deliveries are happening. Also, how well the Ukrainians are doing. How long can they hold out? How long can they keep this fight going? They do, it is a country of 44 million people, but 5.5 million people have left. Over 13 million are internally displaced. And Russia has a lot more people and a lot more stuff. And so, how long can the Ukrainians keep going? I would also worry about Putin's health. Because what I worry about is that he dies and it gets worse.
Right.
Because to the original, your original question, or the second question you asked, he began his presidency by starting a war that was based on false flag operations that there was a lot of evidence before, but given what he's done in Ukraine, it's like, oh, those were probably FSB bombings of the apartment buildings around Russia. For those who don't remember, there was a series of apartment bombings in 1999, and Putin, who was then head of the FSB, blamed them on the Chechens, started this war that allowed him to fly down to the battlefields and show himself to be young and virile and decisive, unlike the ailing Boris Yeltsin. And his popularity went through the roof very, very quickly, right? That's how he started his presidency. Yeah. And now he's bookending it with his presidency with one. And I worry that if he were to die tomorrow, that whoever takes his place would probably be more hard line. And even if they weren't, they would have to prove their bona fides, right? And either have to double down on the war or crank it up, to show that they can't be messed with, and they too are strong. So I mean, this is the problem, is like, right, once you start a war, it's very easy to start one, but it's really hard to wind it down, and it can go in so many terrible and unpredictable directions.
Yeah, no, it's tragic and terrifying in so many ways. I think we're all just lucky that we have your reporting to keep us up to speed. I'm an optimist by sort of nature, so I'm going to completely shift topics now because I don't think there's any optimism coming out of you on this one. Talk to us about Puck and media, and your sort of decision to, you had a very kind of tremendous career in sort of what I would at least describe affectionately as traditional media, but joining John, Joe, and Max and Puck is a big deal. We're the lucky beneficiaries, but tell us your sort of thoughts on media, and I guess maybe how you're able to report here from Puck as opposed to being elsewhere.
Yeah. So once I decided that I was going to be a journalist, or as my parents joke, when I came out of the closet as a journalist, they were not happy. I thought, okay, overachieving immigrant kid, have to, like, what's the best place to work? I have to go work there. And then over the course of my career, I realized that I just really, really hate legacy media. Like, they produce great stuff, but working for them was my version of hell. It was, it never worked well. Like, my personality was too big for them. I hated the whole culture of like kiss the ring and show gratitude for being here. Like, you're constantly reminded that, if you don't like it, there's 100 other people who would be happy to take your place. And, my thinking was like, this isn't like charity, right? This is capitalism. I give you something and then you give me money for it. And like, that's how this works. And why do I also have to like kiss your ass while I'm doing this? And I just felt like it was like I always had to kind of squeeze myself into a shape that didn't work for me. And also, a lot of these legacy publications are incredibly bureaucratic, incredibly political, all these big personalities in one space. And I was never particularly good at either bureaucracy or politics. And I just felt like, I would start tripping over my own feet. And I just felt like it was just a waste of my time, because like the thing I was good at was writing and reporting, and, and like, why do I have to spend my time doing all this other shit? So I feel like at PUC, I have a lot of freedom and it just feels like I'm working with peers. Like, there's a tremendous amount of mutual respect and an understanding that we all want each other. We all want to do well, and we all want to do right by each other, because we're partners, because there isn't this harsh hierarchy. I feel like I can put myself into my reporting. Like, I don't have to have this kind of baronial, detached air, that I can speak directly to readers and break down the fourth wall, because this isn't rocket science. It's actually not that hard. I don't know. And it just,
I get the culture. I get the cultural thing, but beyond that, I would hope, and I think, at least sitting on our end of being consumers, that there's something about the format that allows, liberation from maybe.
that's what I mean. I
Yeah,
feel like
exactly. Yeah,
like all my energy is spent on writing and reporting and thinking about what my readers want. And I feel like I have a direct connection to my readers, more than, writing a piece for the internet and just putting it out there and seeing who
yeah,
reads it. This is like well curated, and there's feedback. I also feel like they're coming to see what I say, not for what, the New Yorker thinks. And so I can tell them what I think, and I don't have to put on airs. And again, it's that, like, the breaking down the fourth wall is something we
yeah.
talk about all the time. And I really enjoy kind of, I think what my readers have really appreciated over the last 4 months is that basically I'm bringing them into the conversations that I'm having. So like, if it's interesting to me, I'm just assuming that it'll be interesting to my readers, and I'll, hit up some old friends or old sources and talk to them, and I'm like bringing my readers along with me to show them how this works.
Well, we are all very lucky. So thank you. I would be able to go on talking to you forever here, but I do have questions from the audience. But because we pivoted so quickly, and thank you to everybody for scrambling to make this Zoom thing work, I'm going to kind of just pick out a few questions, just being sensitive to time. So these are from our audience here. The first one says, assuming we can get to a place where hostility in the Ukraine comes to an end, what is the possibility of reintegrating Russia into the world economy and the world community more broadly? I mean, I guess given the conversation we just had, feels unlikely to you that that's a near-term reality.
I don't know if it's a near-term reality, but it should be a long-term goal. And that also will have to be done with Ukrainians at the table, because even if the fighting stops tomorrow, there has to be some reckoning inside Russia for what was done, not just for the, atrocities that the Russian troops have committed, but also for the destruction they've wrought in Ukraine and all the lives they've broken. And there will have to be some kind of justice, I think, before Russia can be reintegrated. And that's going to be a tough sell for the Russians. Most countries, again, as we can see from the US, like most countries don't like having to take responsibility for their sins. They want to believe that they're that they were the
Right.
good guys. But
Right.
how do you reintegrate Russia into the world or into the West without doing that? So I
No,
think
it feels pretty complicated right now, and
Mhm.
certain bells seem to have been rung that can't be unrung. I mean, it's not
Totally.
easy. I guess it's not easy to call somebody a war criminal, but it's definitely harder to un-war criminal them.
Mhm.
Um, the next
But
question.
I think to your point, I don't think that can happen with Vladimir Putin in power.
No,
So he has to go first, and then we'll see what happens.
somebody asks, you've previously said that Putin goes for the maximum and then settles for less. What would that even mean right now, given the state of play?
Well, you're already seeing him do that, right? They withdrew from around Kiev, and he started this war by announcing maximalist aims, right? The basic dismantling of Ukraine and Ukrainian identity. And now it's like, oh, JK was about the Donbass and taking the Black Sea and Azov Sea coasts. And you have kind of the hawks within Russia saying, no, 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 that's not good. Let's go back to the original plan. But you can see that he's trying to kind of ratchet the mission down a little bit to something more manageable, because he clearly bit off more than he can chew. The question is, you know, will the hardliners in his government let him do that now?
Yeah. Next question, which is a good question, but just given kind of what you've already said, the question is, how do you believe Putin will assess his goals were met? How do you think this is impacting the Russian-speaking diaspora? I mean, I guess the question is, for somebody that maybe we overestimate as this grand strategist and tactician, are there, kind of goals or specific goals, or are they just ever-changing goals?
For him,
Yeah.
I
How is
think
he? Is he getting? I mean, the next question is, can you shed light on the views around whether Putin is now getting better information on the state of the war and how he's responding to negative outcomes the military is experiencing? So I guess they're sort of related, which is he getting better info now? And if he is getting better info now, how is he recalculating what success could even look like for him?
I mean, we know so little, but it seems like he's starting to, and that's maybe why they've pivoted. It's really hard to say. It's such a closed circle. I just ran, it went up yesterday on Puck, an interview with Catherine Belton, who wrote an amazing book called Putin's People about the
Yeah.
oligarchs around Putin. And I was asking her who Putin talks to, because the Times had it as 3 people. She had it as one person, his buddy from the KGB, and
Yeah.
who's crazier than Putin. And Putin's like the moderate, which is crazy. So that it's such a closed environment. We don't know
Right.
how much he's getting good information, but he's clearly recalibrating. The hard thing is that this was a legacy issue for him. And I think what's scary is that he's thinking about how he's going to be written about in the history books. He wants to be Vladimir the Great. He's not thinking about how many Russian soldiers die. He's not thinking about how many Ukrainians die. He wants to seal his place in history. And when somebody's thinking about things in such abstract and kind of dehumanized, impersonal ways, I think that's very dangerous. So I think there's like a limit to how much he can dial back, because he's thinking about these grand things, if that makes sense. And
Totally.
he's evolved on that front too. I think he wanted to be remembered in Russian history as somebody who brought wealth and stability to Russia after the chaos of the 80s and 90s. And then it became about something bigger, right? Then he like dialed it up, and it became about how he's seen on the world stage. Although that's something he's been talking about forever. One of the things that really annoys me about American coverage of this is people keep asking, what does Vladimir Putin want? Or what does he really want? And he's been very clear about what he wants, and he's been pretty consistent about what he wants in many ways, right? Like, you can go back and read his speech at the Munich Security Conference, for example.
Right.
He has been very clear about what he wants, right? And
Yep.
it's just about, just as Donald Trump is very clear about what he wants. You just have to like believe what they're telling you, and not just saying like, take him seriously but not literally.
Got it. Last Russia question, because we are running out of time. What are you expecting to hear on Victory Day on May 9th? What are you expecting to hear from him, or is it really up in the air?
I expect to hear a lot of Nazi talk, a lot of Nazi talk, and framing the current war as a continuation of World War II. I think Putin has been obsessed with World War II and has, because it has such resonance for so many Russians, genuine resonance, because of those massive casualty counts, he has managed to make it this kind of unifying, in the absence of ideology early on, make it into this unifying nationally, this idea, and now harnessing it for this war. I'm going to look to see how else they're going to twist this. By the way, we heard the Russian foreign minister the other day say that, people in the West keep saying that Ukraine can't be Nazi because they have a Jewish president. Well, Hitler also had some Jewish blood. And as we know, he said, some of the worst anti-Semites historically have been Jews, which is very special. I worry that the intelligence reports that we're seeing leaking into the press about him actually declaring war on Ukraine, because this is a special military operation, I worry that he's going to do that, and that he will call up the reserves, which means this war will go on for much, much longer. That's what I'm worried about.
Well, we will see. So for the last minute we have here, what is your media diet look like? Who are the journalists, and what are the kind of media rags that you turn to on a daily basis? One of my favorite questions.
So I'm an NPR junkie. It's like always playing. It's how I kind of get my basic news, like the base level information, passively as I'm doing stuff around my house. Recently, I've been mostly reading Russian and Ukrainian press. I read Meduza a lot, which is an independent Russian publication, which everybody should support. They have been doing amazing reporting on Russia. I've been reading Media Zona, which was founded by Pussy Riot, also has been doing great work. BBC Russia, reading a lot of Puck to find out what the hell Elon Musk is doing. And then a lot of stuff on Twitter, but that's different because of the war, because it's just changing so fast.
Sure. Well, thank you. Really, truly, thank you from everybody here. Your insight is truly unique, and thank you for scrambling. And at this point,
I'm so sorry.
This is life now, unfortunately. But at this point, we're all just wishing you well and feel good and get home safe and take care of yourself. And we're going to say thank you for the night.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, good to see you, Julia.
All right.
Bye-bye.